What's up, Alex? Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited to have you on the show because not only are you somebody who I respect a lot as a colleague, you're also somebody I've been working with my own strength training programming in the last few months and lifting at your gym. And just so glad that I have a coach like you, on my team, because even though I love coaching, there's just some things like Zercher squats that I don't want to do unless I have somebody making me do them. So I'm excited to get into all things strength training with you today.
Hell yeah. No, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah.
And we tend to have good conversations. It'll be fun to have one, recorded.
Yeah, totally. Sometimes I look at my watch when I'm in the gym lifting and I'm thinking like okay, I've got time. I can like bend Alex's ear about this particular thing. We have a lot of things in common in terms of our philosophy, our approach, but I also learn a lot from you. And I think that's the really cool part about working with somebody like yourself who has a ton of experience, but you also have just a really great head on your shoulders and you're really well balanced in your approach with strength training, especially for, athletes in other sports. And I always pick up little nuggets from you along the way. And I just feel so lucky that I'm able to be in there and chit chatting with you on the daily and stuff like that. So it's really,
I think I yap a little too much sometimes.
well, you and me both. And sometimes you get a little bit of just sort of, reassurance of your own, like, okay, yeah, like somebody else thinks this too. And it's awesome. So I know for the listeners, they may not know about your gym, but a lot of the athletes that you work with are in the sport of Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. How did you decide that you were going to start working alongside Jiu-jitsu athletes with strength training? And what are some of the biggest challenges you've encountered with bringing strength training into this sport?
Yeah, so I decided a long time ago that I wanted to do this. I wasn't really too certain of the path, but I sort of had like a bit of a North Star. Um, when I was in school at the University of Connecticut, I remember there was a day in one of like our sport administration classes. It was all of the exercise science majors, but they went through and they asked us like where we wanted to go with our career. And I said that I wanted to be I wanted to do strength and conditioning in jiu-jitsu. And the instructor, he doesn't know jiu-jitsu. He was like, oh, does that exist? Like, is there a place you can go for that? That was like before the, UFC Performance Institute. Like, there was nothing even in that realm. And I was like, yeah, not really. And he's like, well, how are you going to do that? I'm like, I don't know. I've trained for a long time. Maybe I'll go train with those guys and see where it goes. And kind of not a great answer in academia, but that's kind of what I did. I moved out here, started training at Atos, started competing with those guys in 2015. And then very quickly, started to work with JT Torres first. And from there, it really opened up to like the rest of the comp team. And now plenty of people, that are not affiliated with Atos, of course, like, I train with a lot of them. So it's fun working with them, but I love working with people from any sort of affiliation. So that's kind of how it got started. The challenges, I'd say the biggest one, I think there's a few angles we could look at this, but in a sport that really started from the idea that a smaller, less physical opponent can utilize technique and leverage to overcome or neutralize a stronger, more athletic opponent. That's what really brings people into the sport initially. So it's kind of tough, it's like this little counterculture of like the small guy, right? And I think a lot of competitors understand they've been matched technically with another opponent and have felt that, a stronger or more explosive or more conditioned competitor might end up beating them. So they're an easy sell. It's the everyday practitioner, someone who listens to the Joe Rogan podcast or, whatever. They get into it because they like that trope. It's a hard sell to them. And even like, showing them that heavy lifting and stuff, it's not just about building this brute muscular athlete. It's about longevity. It's about preventing injury or mitigating or minimizing injury so that you can spend more time on the mats. That's really the angle that I've taken with it. that's the thing that's central to the way that I train. You know, I do different forms of strength and conditioning so that, you know, back in 2018, when I wanted to jump into rock climbing, I could jump into rock climbing, right? Like I like learning new things, and it's not just the one sport that I do. But I like to train in a way that allows my body to encounter stressful situations and sort of take it in stride. That's really like the undercurrent of my training. And whether it's the hobbyist that I'm working with or the high level competitor, the most important thing is lifting in such a way that we induce positive changes in tissue quality that allow that person to express their athletic potential in whatever area that they want to, and experience less injuries and train for longer. Because deep down, you know, if you train jiu-jitsu, you don't want to have that last day where you hang up the gi and you go, man, I can't keep up with this anymore, right? And strength training is our ticket to do that.
Absolutely. I am 45 as of the time of this recording. So having been athletic really my whole life, and now doing a sport where, you know, I love the creativity of jujitsu memes and gifs and things like that on the internet and reels. And there's no, it is an endless source of entertainment, because in a way we've been there. We're like, oh, you know, I always joke, when you get a brown belt, it should come with a complimentary bottle of like ibuprofen and a lifetime subscription to get tape for your fingers. Like we know little things are going to happen, and the longer you're on the mats, like shit happens, right? But at the same time, to be aging now into my mid 40s, I know people who are training who are in their 70s. Like, we want the best runway, I think, for doing those things for as long as possible. But if we're not taking care of our bodies, we're not building the resilience and making ourselves more anti-fragile, as you say, then it's just gonna be that much harder to participate in a sport that is very unpredictable and very explosive and very physical. I mean, what we do is extremely physical. There's a ton of contact. There's probably people listening to this show who don't do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but they do other sports or they have other interests and hobbies. So I want them to listen to this conversation through that lens. Like some of the things you might be specifically talking about in this podcast may be a little bit more jiu-jitsu related, but take whatever sport you like. I mean, pickleball is like taking people out left and right these days. You know, people are like, oh, I hurt my knee playing pickleball. Oh, you know, I did this, that, and the other. So just like, listen, I want people to listen through that filter as they're listening to whatever you're going to say today, where it's like, how can I take this concept and apply it to me as an athlete or as somebody participating as a hobbyist in these other things that I like, even if it's not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? With that in mind, I know that there is this culture in Jiu-Jitsu that's like being strong is almost like an insult. So I'd love for you to talk about, when it comes to jiu-jitsu and like actual strength training, what are some things that people can benefit from by getting into the weight room, getting into the gym and lifting for their game?
Yeah, and the thing that I am gonna like lead off with is that this is true, uh, whether the application is jujitsu, or it's the reason that I brought up, you know, rock climbing or whatever the thing might be, right? I think in general there's a lot of low hanging fruit for the you know, for our body and for its ability to perform and encounter stressful environments. And I'll go through each of those in turn. So I think you've got the musculoskeletal system and tissue quality, and whether that is bone, tendons, ligaments, you know, muscles, cartilage, anything in between. Those things all remodel positively to the right dose of stress. And strength training is a very deliberate way to place that stress on the body. We can do it through lots of different ways. You've always got those people that are like, oh yeah, what about a manual labor job? Sure. I mean, when we apply stress to the body, it will adapt positively. The thing with a manual labor job is the fact that, like, you know, it's not about like, okay, how do I stress this one joint to an ideal level of fatigue, and then I stop, and then I go home and I have my protein shake, right? Like, it's not the physical, you know, a job in labor is not as measured as that. It's just kind of like, all right, you got to move all of this shit here over here. And it doesn't matter, like you have to complete that task. It doesn't matter how much it does or doesn't affect certain tissues. So it's not as direct, deliberate, or measured. Strength training is a really good way to do that. And we can do it in a relatively short amount of time. 2 45-minute workouts where we emphasize multi-joint movements, your hinge, your squat, your push, your pull, maybe some unilateral stuff, some lunging, and then a little bit of single joint stuff. If you want to really like go over the top, boom, we've nailed that. We're going to improve tissue quality. If we are increasing our performance of those movements over time, our bones are going to get denser, cartilage going to get denser, ligaments are going to hypertrophy, tendons are going to improve in stiffness. The list goes on and on. Our body will become better at encountering physical stress. That's huge. So first low-hanging fruit is improving tissue quality in that musculoskeletal system. The next one is actually going to be lumped in with that, but really emphasizing range of motion as we do that. We don't have to train mobility or stretching separately. There's a lot of motions. If you add a deficit to a Bulgarian split squat, we can get some mobility and we can start to improve force production or tolerance at those end ranges, sometimes a bit better than we can with just stretching. So you really emphasize range of motion as you do that, and you're going to get some mobility with that as well. Another low-hanging fruit is energy system development, right? A little bit of cardio. It doesn't take much. And no, lifting is not cardio, even if you end up breathing heavy, right? We could get really into the nitty-gritty details, but the occlusion effect from like bracing, bearing down, using your muscles, your heart rate can go up sort of regardless of cardiovascular stimulus, right? If you walked around a corner, or actually, you startled me the other day in the gym. When my heart rate went up from that was not a cardiovascular stimulus. My body was not utilizing more oxygen, right? Same thing. If you have an energy drink with some caffeine, it's going to increase your heart rate. That is not a cardiovascular stimulus, and neither is lifting weights. So some of the low-hanging fruit is cardiovascular training. I think some easy zone 2 or 3 cardio for longer durations is a great way to do it, and to mix in some stuff that is higher in effort, which would be much shorter in length. Something I've been doing since I got this watch is I've been sort of microdosing my interval training before I go home for the day. I don't want to be stuck here sweaty all day. So literally right before I go home, I'll do a quick circuit. And like, it's crazy how now that I'm measuring this regularly, my resting heart rate is already noticeably, like in a relatively short amount of time, decreasing. Again, it's that low-hanging fruit. I wasn't taking advantage of it before. I'm putting a minimal time investment in, but I'm being consistent and things are moving. And then the last one I would say is explosiveness or power or rate of force development, doing some sort of plyometrics, getting your body accustomed to impact, to not just applications of force like strength training, but rapid ones, and not just producing force, but absorbing it. So not just when you leave the ground, but then when you encounter the ground once again. That's very important as well. I know it sounds like a lot, right? But if you lump in mobility with your strength training, that's going to account for your tissue quality. You got some cardiovascular stuff that you do on its own, and you do maybe some power work before some of those motions in the weight room. Seriously, 2 bouts of 45 minutes can encompass the tissue quality, the range of motion / mobility, and the power. You can get your low-hanging fruit in an hour and a half a week there. And then you add in some dedicated cardio work. Could be walking while you listen to a podcast for a long duration, right? Could be a shorter interval thing. But like, these things don't have to take over your life. You don't have to live as like a new fitness influencer, right? Even people like you and me who build our life around it, like, I don't want to be doing 6 hours of cardio a week, so I'm not going to, right? But I can still hit that low-hanging fruit and see improvements if I'm consistent with it. So I think the big thing is hitting that low-hanging fruit. If there's one of those areas that you're missing, add it in, and not a ton, just a little bit. If you apply that consistently over 6-12 months, you will see massive improvements in quality of life, transfer to sport, injury prevention, etc.
Absolutely. I'm going to poke the bear a little bit because I know you fairly well. And I know the things that really like get your goat, or you want to just like bust this myth, right? So one of the things I hear a ton is if I lift weights, I'm going to get hurt. And that's going to take me out of jujitsu, even though, you know, these are the people like hobbling onto the mats. We've seen them. Bless, right? Like they can barely make it on the mat. So talk to me sort of about this intersection when it comes to people's fear that they're going to do this strength training program, it's going to hurt them, then they're going to be taken out of their sport. So, you know, I guess the companion to this would be you do sustain an injury potentially in jujitsu, you're still there back there in class training, but you're going to skip the gym. So talk me through like, what are your thoughts on that sort of like injury risk mitigation? Like when we start to think about jujitsu, like how do we bring those disparate thoughts together?
Yeah. So it's tough, right? Because if someone's already got their mind made up, and the thing that they fear the most is an injury in the weight room that takes them away from jujitsu, you know, sort of like you and I have said before, something I'm big on is like, I'm not going to paint some like fantasy land for somebody, right? Can you get hurt in the weight room? Yeah, of course you can, right? You can get hurt tying your shoes. The worst back pain I ever felt was playing with a puppy. Am I never going to play with a puppy again? Like, hell no. Of course I'm going to play with puppies. Like, injuries, pain, they're very complex, right? And I think what is a liberating thought when we can really wrap our head around it is the fact that they are inevitable. Now, I get that that could be scary to some people, but when we recognize that it's inevitable, we start to expect that living an active or a sedentary lifestyle, they're going to happen. Once we sort of accept that they're part of our reality, that biological organisms experience pain, we start to be able to treat dealing with those things as a skill in and of itself, so that when they roll along, you get better at dealing with them. Part of that is prevention. And yes, when we apply stress to the body, there is always risk involved. If we change gears a little bit, it tends to make more sense to people. Not sure why, but if I had, you know, a client come to me and they have multiple risk factors for cardiovascular disease, right? And they tell me, hey, I want to make sure that I have the lowest chance of actually having a heart attack in my lifetime. I'd be like, all right, we're going to stress your heart together. Now we're going to do it in a deliberate, incremental manner. But we have to stress your heart. And when we do that, in that short term, our risk goes up, right? And this is sort of the thing that I work through with people. If I was going to keep the answer shorter, it's don't conflate short and long-term risk. Yes, with lifting, there is a short-term risk of musculoskeletal injury. And that risk goes up relative to baseline. Long-term, the risk goes down dramatically. There's a massive meta-analysis that shows there's a 69% decrease in injury in sport when long-term strength training is introduced. So like, okay, yes, there is a slight increase in risk during the strength training session, but it's not an increase of 69%. So overall, your risk goes down. Yes, if all you're looking for is like the one example of somebody who got hurt not doing their sport and then it kept them from their sport, sure, you might go, I can't do that thing. And that thing is strength training or playing with puppy dogs or whatever you want to make it be, right? But playing with puppy dogs, as cool as that is, doesn't give you any decreased rate of injury in sport. Strength training markedly does. So again, like it's sort of being able to separate for people or guide them to separating the difference between short and long-term risk. And I think that example of the person with the cardiovascular risk factors is a great way to do it. If I wanted to make sure I didn't increase their short-term risk, I'd sit down and play checkers with that person. And I would have the lowest possible chance of that person having a heart attack when they were with me. But I would also probably guarantee that one day that person would succumb to that heart attack, right? So again, with that person, I'd explain to them and be like, hey, I get it. At first, you know, you might be a little uneasy increasing your heart rate, feeling yourself stressed, but know that as a coach, I'm going to create a little staircase approach and we're not going to jump up to the top of the stairs right away. We're just going to hop on that first step. You might even feel like that first session's too easy. But eventually we find ourselves far enough up that staircase where we can turn around and look and be like, oh my God, look how far I've come. That's the goal, right? And that is where then the long-term benefit far, far outweighs that short-term risk. And with both strength training and cardiovascular training, the short-term risk goes down the more experienced you get at it. So like, yeah, it's not a reason to avoid it. It's like, let's figure this out. Let's accept that injuries are inevitable and let's get good at dealing with them. And the weight room should also be our safe zone when we do get hurt. Before I talked about how it's a very measured and deliberate way to apply stress. Well, when you went through a recent injury and you came to me, I wasn't like, all right, this plan, all we're going to do is a ton of heavy, rapid, elbow-centric stuff. Like, hell no, right? We were like deliberate about how we tested that out, how we saw, like, I wanted to get into Zerchers because that was better, but I didn't just throw them in there because it's loading something close to that area. So as uncomfortable as it's been, it doesn't seem to be making the symptoms any worse. So this seems like a good thing to proceed with. And I think that when people start to trust that the weight room is this deliberate thing where we don't just make bad things worse, as opposed to a sports context, right? Like you could go in with, let's say, a bad neck in jiu-jitsu and be like, all right, I'm just gonna pass today because I can't invert and play guard. So you go in with that plan, but jiu-jitsu is unpredictable and you can't fully control what goes on. And then someone clubs your head, even though you were passing, and you're like, fuck, I heard it again. You start to realize that these other environments are way more open-ended than the gym. You don't have nearly as much control. So I like to show people like, hey, we got a ton of control in here. If picking up the 40-pound dumbbell hurts, guess what we're not going to do today? We're not going to pick up the 40-pound dumbbell. But yeah, I think short versus long-term risk is huge. The control that we truly have in the weight room is huge. And as people start to understand those different concepts and how they apply to the weight room, they start to trust it a bit more, and they view it as a safe space that I know that you and I do.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And I think that distinction between the short and the long term is so important. And oftentimes, our human brains, we go back to our lizard brain and we're like, oh, this thing hurts. Right now this seems really scary. So therefore I'm just, I'm going to stay away from the gym, or I'm just not going to participate. I mean, I have tons of people that I work with that are over 40, 50, 60. You just get, I mean, I don't know anybody who's like, yep, like my body feels 100% all the time. You've got little aches and pains, past injury, past surgery, you're working around things. You're just, living the human experience in this human body, and things do happen. But it's really common for people to think, oh, well, and to use me as that example, I hurt my elbow during Worlds. Got armbarred really hard, was trying to tap, ref didn't stop it until I verbally tapped. And so whatever, shit happens. But I wasn't about to say, well, my elbow's kind of bothering me, so I'm just not going to come in and do anything. Like, I don't know. What do you think the gap is there? Is it lack of working with somebody a little bit more closely who can help you understand, well, hey, there's still a bunch we can do? Is it just old school thinking, less progressive thinking about, well, you've sustained an injury or have something here that's kind of bothering you, so you shouldn't do anything? I mean, where do you think that comes from? And then how do we sort of like help the mental aspect, do you think, of working people through that?
I think it's twofold. One, people become more risk averse as they age, right? I mean, thinking back at to myself at 20, I was reckless, right? Like I was dumb. Um, so in a lot of cases that becoming more risk averse as we age tends to be a good thing, but there's applications where it doesn't serve us. And I think following an injury, all of a sudden, like falling back to like this safe area of being totally sedentary is like a misapplication of being a bit risk averse, right? So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing, and this is tied into that, is that it's a bit of a survival mechanism to not want to like touch the hot stove again, right? Where uh you do something, it could even not be in the weight room, you could get hurt elsewhere, but you did it through activity and you're like, no activity now, I don't want to touch the stove, right? I got to go back to this. And that's like a huge lesson. Like I had, it's kind of funny when I've had an LCL injury on both knees. And the first one happened in college, and it really was not that bad, but it was my first time injuring anything since my shoulder in college, which was actually quite bad. And so I catastrophized like real hard. And I remember I was interning uh, with the strength coach that was actually, a huge part, Maureen Butler at UConn. She's a huge part of why my training, style and system is the way that it is. But I remember I told her I hurt my knee and like I missed a session. And like thinking back on this, I'm like, oh God, I was such a freaking wuss, right? And I told her that I was missing a session. And then the next one I came in, I had crutches. And she like looks at me sideways. Mind you, hopefully she's not listening to this, but she's like, she's maybe 5 foot, right? And I remember her like looking at me sideways and she's just like, why the hell are you on crutches? And I'm like, I hurt my knee. She's like, it's just LCL, right? And I'm like, yeah. She's like, I don't know what you need crutches for. And she like walks off to like go do something else. And I remember I was like, what the heck? Is she crazy? But like having experienced more injuries, seen other other athletes sort of catastrophize things, I get it now. I was like babying the shit out of it. I didn't even go to intern hours. I wasn't even lifting. I would have just been like standing there. Like, yeah, I could do that with a popped LCL. Like, of course. Right. And I was like, oh, I can't do anything. And I like stayed in my house. So I've been there too. I get it. Fast forward all the way to 2017 at Nogi Worlds. I had such an extensive incident to my LCL while competing that also like my hamstring tendon partially tore. And I remember like I wanted to do my neck. I was up I think 12-0 in that fight, and I finished it. And then I wanted to do the next one, but it was like really starting to lock up on me in between. Like, it was pretty painful as the adrenaline sort of worked its way out of the system. I was like, man, I might not be feeling too great. And I remember the next day, like, even though it was a mess, it was swollen and everything, I'm like holding on to my couch and doing like assisted squats and like really trying to like grab this recovery process by the horns and like see what I was capable of, really assess what's wrong with my knee. Don't just baby it and like just sit there freaking out. Like, no, let's see what this thing can do. Let's see how bad it is. And like, if it's really bad, I'll know, and it turns out like I bounced back from that second one so much faster than the first one, despite the fact that there was more, we had talked about the biopsychosocial part. In terms of biomechanical damage, there was more to more structures and more to the LCL. And I bounced back faster because of that approach. So I think sometimes when it's new to somebody, very quickly, they just want to like, run back into their cave and hide. And I think it's important that like as coaches, we sort of, without being reckless, but like having them come in and like, hey, let's work through this a little bit. Let's do some really low risk things. Let me show you like ways we can just like mobilize and move the knee, and you can explore these ranges and see what's doable and see what's not. And then all of a sudden the world opens up and they're just like, okay, I'm working through this. This isn't so bad, right? And it tends to be a really good thing when you take your own recovery and rehab into your own hands. Even if you're not a PT and you don't know these things, like you have spent your whole life living in your body, and you can do some things that are relatively low risk to sort of assess like, okay, well, there's this elbow I've had my whole life. Can't straighten it all the way. It's a little weird. All right, maybe I won't do that for a little bit. But like that's essentially the process, right? Like take that ownership, explore a little bit. And if you constantly run into the fact that like, man, I'm trying to go through this in an organized way and I can't, okay, that's when you're like, this is maybe really bad, and maybe then you get it checked out. But the vast majority of musculoskeletal injuries have a positive natural outcome. Give them enough time in the right environment, and your body knows what to do from there. So it's important that this part of the body doesn't become like a big roadblock for us in that process.
Alex is pointing to his brain, his head, for those of you listening and not watching. Yeah, it's, when I think that was on the Thursday when I came in and walked over to the table and was pretty upset. I've hurt this elbow before and I was just like, fuck. But then I was like, all right, well, I'll see you guys on Monday. And got into the gym. We are trying some different squat variations. And I was like, yeah, back squats is going to be a no-go right now. But like, that's when the conversation around Zercher came up, and then we're like, yeah, there's something else we can do here. And I think for people having to have options, and I don't know if this has played into sort of how people feel about this, but they're like, well, the back squat is the only way to squat, that sort of thing online where you get people arguing, the high bar squat's the only way to squat. No, it's the low bar squat. And you have people who are very polarized about these, like, this is the only right way to squat, or the only right way to deadlift, or the only right way to move your shoulder, or whatever it is. And so people feel like they're automatically going to have to self-select that out. Like if you have a shoulder thing going on, maybe back squatting isn't the best thing for you, or an elbow thing, but hey, you can find a safety bar and squat that way. You could find a belt squat and squat that way, so there are options. And I think the more proactive people can be in terms of problem solving, like, it's just the better off, instead of going, well, I can't do that thing that was in my program, so I can't squat at all, or I can't do whatever.
I also think one other thing that plays a huge role is people's belief that if they misstep again, that it's all over for them. Like, we tried out the back squat for you and you were like, yeah, this isn't happening. It's putting some pressure here. And your arm didn't light on fire. You didn't fall to the ground like clutching at your heart, right? Like, it was, you were like, okay, I'm getting some signals here that this is not a good thing. Let's move on to something different. And I think that's big too. People think they have to navigate this. Like, rehab is like almost like this mystic process of navigating this perfect path where you feel zero pain, there's no setbacks. Every day is better than the day before it. And I think it's also kind of liberating to know that that's not the rehab process, even with the best professionals, the best imaging, the best whatever in the world. That's not how that process works. There are missteps. Those missteps are not catastrophic, right? They're actually they're a feature, not a bug, right? That's how we figure out where we're going. And as long as you are measured in terms of your progressions and the way that you're testing things out, that's totally fine. And I think liberating people from that, as opposed to like, when you take a step back and you look at the way liability works in the medical system, you start to understand why doctors say some of the things that they do, right? They don't know that Frank here is going to be able to navigate nuance and figure out how to bench press with his new shoulder injury. He's just going to say, hey, you can't bench press for X, right? Because the last thing that doctor wants is for that advice to be misused, or for Frank to not understand any nuance and then come back and sue the doctor because he goes, yeah, you said to just bench a little lighter. So I went from benching 365 to 315 and I fucked myself up, and that's your fault. Like, so doctors will, to protect themselves, give like the hyper conservative answer. But then people internalize that, right? And they're like, oh man, I can't mess this up. Okay, doctor told me to do nothing for 2 weeks. When I hurt my knee last time, I hurt my knee this time. I've got to do nothing for 2 weeks. And it's like, okay, we can do better. Like, you have to understand the shortcomings of the medical system in that sense. And like, an example I use with clients is like, okay, whatever their injury is. Let's say LeBron had that injury today. Tomorrow, his PT or his ortho wouldn't be like, oh yeah, LeBron, I know. Well, yeah, you got that playoff series coming up. Okay, well, you're going to do nothing for the next 2 weeks. Oh yeah, no, shoot around. No, nothing. You're not going to do anything. Oh, rehab? No, we'll start that in 2 weeks. You're doing nothing, LeBron. Like, obviously that doesn't happen, right? And when people start to understand that, like, okay, well, LeBron gets a little bit more face time with his ortho than the 14 business minutes you get with yours, they're able to explore that nuance, right? And I think when people start to understand that, and know that, like, it's not gospel what that doctor says, it's a professional recommendation that comes with limitations for that person's practice. You take it with a grain of salt. You sort of, you rule out any red flags if you are going to that professional or whatever, but you can't internalize that do nothing for 2 weeks or whatever it may be and think that that is the best approach to recovery, because it's not. And all that's doing is giving you an easy answer to latch onto, something that your fear can fuel, and it becomes this vicious circle. So I try to explain it in more of like that context from the outside, like, hey, I'm not saying don't listen to doctors. Listen to doctors. They're a very useful tool. They're very educated. They know things, right? Like take advantage of that. But like, just like I wouldn't want someone to take all of every word I say as gospel, like take it with a grain of salt, see the limitations. If I'm training somebody online, there's going to be limitations with that, right? So like understand what those limitations are, take whatever value you still can, and go from there.
Absolutely. I want to pivot just back a little bit to some jujitsu specific strength training stuff because, all right, let's say somebody's like, but Alex, I am strength training. What I'm doing is like, I do a shit ton of like burpees. I'm doing like jumping around, doing stuff between my sets because I'm trying to like burn off more calories. Maybe I'm cutting weight, or maybe I just feel like I have to be super active all the time. Or I'm doing things like, trying to strengthen my grip for my strength for rear naked chokes. So I'm like rear naked choking a foam roller. Like, I'm doing these, gi pull-ups. Like, I know that there are some things that are very pervasive in the jujitsu world in terms of like, well, this is how you get stronger. So let's say somebody is doing those things. What are maybe some of the underrated and overrated things that people are doing for jujitsu specific strength training that you've noticed and that you speak about and that you wish would change?
Well, that depends. Am I getting asked this at like a party? Because I've changed the way that
Mm,
that I do this. When someone asks me stuff like that at like a social event and like they heard that I'm like a trainer or whatever and they want to like talk to me about that, I just agree. They're like choking they're showing me the video of them like choking on a foam roller. I'm like, that's tight. That's
No,
really
I think from the perspective of somebody who's actually curious, like they've taken the step, they're like, okay, like I know getting stronger for jujitsu is important, but what the sort of application of that concept is leading them to things like, I don't know, foam roller choking and doing, gi pull-ups and the things that people do because they see that and they think that this is right, or they're filling their rest periods with burpees or, things like that because it's going to help them be more efficient. So this is a person you can assume wants to learn how to do things better,
Yep.
and they want to hear it.
Cool. Yeah. No, I just say that because like at social events, people just want validation, and I'm like, yeah, that's they're like, yeah, I've been in a carnivore, and this is where my HDL and my LDL is. I'm like, that's so cool. But yeah, no, when it comes down to somebody like structuring their own thing, I think a lot of these fads and everything else can really be cleared up with one principle: track what you're doing and assess it, right? If like and when you start doing that, a lot of these like fad like things will fade away. So you'll be like, damn, I'm not really getting better, right? Like for example, I mentioned like the occlusion effect of like lifting for cardio, and that really contributes to your heart rate a lot in circuits. Well, if somebody is tracking objective metrics for cardiovascular fitness and they're doing endless circuits, they might find that short of them being terribly out of shape at first and getting like some beginner gains, like they're like, damn, as a long-term strategy, this doesn't seem to be panning out that much. I'm doing all these circuits. I'm tired as hell. I'm sore as shit, but my resting heart rate's not really going down. If I do a VO2 max assessment, that's not really moving. Like, what am I doing? Or like, I have other people who just, they do stuff that's cardio related. And again, they don't assess. And I compare that to like lifting, where imagine you went into the gym first and you put duct tape over all the dumbbells and like you're moving stuff around, like you're doing work, but like, what are you doing? Are you tracking it? What did you do last Tuesday? If you don't have a way to know that, like, how do we know that this effort that we're putting in is actually yielding the results we want? So really, I think the vast majority of these issues, the like, let me grab random things I've seen on Instagram, that really only flourishes when somebody's not like tracking and assessing what they're doing. If you start tracking and assessing, you'll know what works and what doesn't work. And in general, I think that like, yeah, a lot of people will go into it and they'll be like, all right, well, I want to get better for jujitsu, so my lifting should feel like jujitsu. And jujitsu sure as hell is not like 15 to 30 seconds of effort followed by 3 to 4 minutes of rest. So they won't lift like that. But what are we doing here? You know, when we're looking for changes in tissue quality, that's not going to occur most efficiently through jiu-jitsu, which is why we're going to the weight room, right? And I think, again, a lot of those things, you know, if we are tracking what we're doing, a lot of those things will start to illuminate. If we're just really restricting rest all the time, you're also going to notice that from a strength standpoint, our weights aren't really going to move all that much, right? And for the first couple years that you're doing strength training, couple of years, like you should consistently see increases week by week, not every time, especially if you're training concurrent with jiu-jitsu, but like the monthly trends should be obvious, like very obvious. And again, if you're tracking, those will jump out at you. If you're not tracking and assessing, then you'll continue to sort of spin your wheels and do these random things sort of with blindfolds on. So yeah, I think if you want me to talk about like the specifics of like gi pull-ups, for example, if someone was really tracking and assessing and they start really pushing for performance, it's overloading structures that already get overloaded so much from jiu-jitsu, things that tend to be the like the weakest link that end up experiencing tissue damage anyways. Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
showing the audience my fingers because they're already kind of.
Despite my last 20 years of training, I don't really have too much to show for that, which
I don't know how you got away with that.
uh
Strong fingers.
okay, yeah. So but yeah, I think you know, we're placing overused joints into compromised more use and more direct loading. And if you're tracking it, like if you're really tracking your gi pull-ups and like trying to really tough to trend in a good direction for any significant amount of time. People think that I like, you know, shit talk gi pull-ups from a place of having never tried them. No, I have. And like, you know, I'm also kind of like a child in the weight room, and like there's plenty of things I don't prescribe for people that I try for a long time myself. Gi pull-ups were one of those things. And like if you ever really try to progress them, like high effort sets, a couple of them at least once a week for multiple weeks, like they will not progress like regular ass pull-ups. They won't. They can't. Especially then you throw jujitsu into it, and that's before you ever, like, again, I don't really experience a ton of finger injuries, and I still did not progress all that much. Now, an important caveat is I am a bit heavier, right? Like 230 is not really a great weight to just be like grabbing a gi and like throwing yourself around, especially like, you know, differences in body weight are significant. Differences in like hand architecture are not relative to body weight, right? Which is, again, another limitation of the lift. It just doesn't make sense long term. And if you were tracking that, it would be very obvious to you. You wouldn't need somebody like me saying they're overrated. You would do them for a while and be like, damn, well, when I did pendlay rows, I was able to, you know, have monthly positive trends for months and months and months. And then I made my pulling variation gi pull-ups, and yeah, it improved a little bit over the first few weeks. Then it flatlined. Then I experienced a finger injury, and I had to cut my reps in half, which then, like, think about it. What's that then doing to your lats? Like, you all of a sudden do half of your reps, and it's limited because of a finger injury. And then, like, what's really important, and the thing that really people, it forces them to hurt their fingers more and more. It's really hard to put load management in effect for your fingers, your digits in jiu-jitsu, right? Like even if you buddy tape, even if you do whatever, like they still experience so much trauma. So you're that person doing gi pull-ups and you're doing them regularly and you experienced a finger injury and it had you cut your reps in half. How long will it take you realistically to even just get those reps back to where they were? I mean, it's going to take forever. And that's still to get, you know, a very sub maximal stimulus to your lats and your biceps and everything else. And even your forearms. Like, okay, you do a set of gi pull-ups. An important thing to note, the muscles responsible for grip live mostly in here, in your forearm, right? They're not in your hands. When you finish a set of gi pull-ups, where do you feel it? it's not in your forearms. Those muscles are not like getting this crazy stimulus where they're like, oh man, I'm gonna be so much better at this. You get off there and your hands are like these claws that you can't open, right? And you have to like force your fingers open again. It doesn't even make sense in terms of what we're stressing. We're just overstressing the crap out of those joints. So yeah, again, I think a lot of these things, if we come back to tracking, if you're tracking something, you don't have to be, you know, a genius in this field. You don't have to be an experienced coach. Just write the stuff down. You don't even need a cool app or anything. Just like a notebook, a little like training diary, and just track what you're doing. And if something's not moving for a significant amount of time, try and think why. Maybe it's not such a good thing to do. Try something that's maybe adjacent to it and try that. Maybe try it with a different like work to rest ratio, right? All of a sudden, all these other options open up. You try it with a different work to rest ratio, and all of a sudden you're like, damn, I'm adding weight every week again. Maybe that's better. And all of these principles that you and I will preach, people will get there themselves. You know, if they're just tracking and seeing what works and what doesn't, like the reason you and I preach the things that we do is because I've had some clients for 7 years and they don't get to a point after training with me for 3 months where they're like, all right, dude, what's the secret? Because like nothing's improving anymore, right? Like we don't have that conversation because the stuff works. So yeah, I think all of that comes down to tracking. Be aware of what you're doing. Is it improving? And if it is, great. If it's not, figure out you know, a switch to make.
Absolutely. We did a podcast not too long ago about sort of a lot of popular fitness programs, especially aimed at women that say they're really there to help you build strength, are really just circuit training. And there's no way for you to really track what you're doing. The rest is very limited, very minimal. So a lot of people will come from that and say, you know, maybe I did see some benefits at the start, but like I kind of ran into a hard stop with things actually progressing. So a lot of them kind of come into a strength training program from there. But um, it's hard. It's hard when that's sort of put out there as, you know, this is the one thing, right? Or people will see the accessory exercises or things like that. They're like supposed to be jiu-jitsu specific. And they're like, this is what all these top people do. So I should do this as well. But yeah, collecting that data is super, super important. So, you know, you can see the trend over time. The patterns are really important. Kind of last question and I'll let you go, but you were mentioning moving your joints. And one of the things that is still such a, I don't know what we're going to call this. It's just such a thing that is so pervasive is that we should load progressively all these different joints in our body. But when it comes to the spine, that's like a no-go, you know, we shouldn't do that. You know, only neutral spine, you know, at all times, we should never bend our back. I know you have an entire account dedicated to talking about this, and you've talked about it a lot on both Electrum's page and your own on Instagram. So people can go dive into those posts, but give me your sort of like gospel, I guess, about why the spine is so important, especially in the context of jujitsu. I mean, everyday life, of course, we know as well, but specifically in the sport of jujitsu, why it doesn't make a ton of sense to try avoiding loading your spine when the sport is anything but neutral spine.
Yeah. The first thing I will say is if this is something that someone has like very close to their heart, they've hurt their back before, they feel frustrated. It's a complex topic, and I'll sort of get into some of it right now. But I actually have a 40-minute YouTube video that like I do make memes on this subject and stuff, and I really just try to grab attention with those. But I try to direct some of that attention to this YouTube video because there I go over 24 publications and like a research review. In terms of how I came to these conclusions. I'm not just like pulling this out of thin air or like random anecdotes. I might use some anecdotes and stuff now for the sake of brevity, but yeah, this is a subject that has become like a near obsession of mine. It's something that really like plagues people in general. Bringing it back to the hot stove, like people, you know, the vast majority of people have felt back pain. That back pain has happened usually when their back is being moved through a range and is loaded to some degree. Sure, there are some examples like mine with the puppy where there maybe isn't loading present or there isn't all that much motion, but those things are normally present. So the person goes, all right, hot stove is my spine moving with load, bad. And like that's already in the lizard brain. That's before anybody else tells you or reaffirms that. And I know you mentioned Stu McGill before. He's one of the leading researchers on spine biomechanics. And honestly, as much as I give him shit, he is phenomenal at researching the biomechanics of the spine and the biokinematics of those joints. However, he gets outside of that lane and starts to talk about things like pain science, et cetera. And that's more so my my issue with him. But you have some of these early studies, mostly by Stu McGill, where they take these animal models or spine segments where it's there's a fixed plate, there's a vertebrae, there's the intervertebral disc, the next vertebrae, and then another plate. And they take it out of a dead pig, and they make this spinal segment, and they add various forces of compression, and then they apply different joint angles with that compression. And what one of his most famous studies did is it included flexion cycles, or repeatedly flexing that spinal segment while also applying pressure. And what they did was they mapped out the injury that occurs. In a vacuum, that's a very useful bit of research. Like, I'm not going to hate on that in and of itself. Now, how some people wield that, I will absolutely attack. So that research was largely what fed what I like to call the glass back propaganda, this thought that, like, we've got to keep our spine neutral because look, when we flex it and we apply force, you see the delamination of the collagen matrix along the backside of the disc, which then will herniate or bulge. Cool. With a dead pig spine segment attached to force plates outside of its body, not adapting. Yeah, that's how that happens, right? But like in a living adaptable tissue, the rules are different. And I think, like, really, like, bringing that back to people, like, I look at the broader picture, like, biological organisms adapt positively to stress. Yes, when we go far enough into it, we find that, like, eustress, which is the positive one, becomes de-stress. But, like, in general, everyone's focused on, like, the de-stress. What about the eustress? What about the fact that, like, let's look at the complete absence of stress. What happens when an astronaut goes up to the International Space Station? There's actually studies on humans and animals being in zero-G environments, in a lack of physical stress. The body deteriorates. That's not the answer. Lack of stress is not the answer. It's about applying deliberate amounts of stress to elicit those positive adaptations. And that's true whether we're talking about those, joints in the digits, whether we're talking about the segments of the spine or anything in between. That's what we're looking to do. So yeah, as it relates to the spine, there's a lot of human data that shows that injuries occur in the neutral zone, that, we can see positive changes that occur when you load through different ranges. That impact is beneficial to the spine. There's a famous study that looks at runners as they age. It's like a long-term study, and intervertebral disc thickness is greater in aging runners. The repeated impact of running, which gets demonized as well. Everyone's like, oh, running's so high impact. Yeah, that's actually great. And it's great for our back. And there are countless applications, loading through spinal flexion, extension, lateral flexion, rotation. Like, it shouldn't be a hot take to take any joint and load it through its natural range. That's just like, that's what we do in our day-to-day life. We're going to just do that in a more focused and deliberate setting in the weight room. And I think for me, it's about, like, pulling that fear off of it. I think there's another layer of fear because, when you recently experienced an elbow injury, you're able to live your life. When someone experiences back pain, and this, like, I really empathize with the individual because I've also felt it, it's debilitating. You can't do anything. So I get the fact that the negative outcome is more dire as it relates to the back. I do get that. But avoidance or too little stress is actually worse for us. Like sedentary people experience disc bulges and herniations at a greater rate than weightlifters. So step one, very clear like push, like we got to load this thing, right? Being sedentary isn't the answer. And loading in a zero G environment is definitely not the answer. So we go over this way. Okay, now do injuries occur in these loaded settings? Yes, they do, right? But at a lower rate than literally sitting here doing this interview. Actually, I've been sitting here doing this interview with, and my back actually doesn't feel that great. I'm actually going to go lift after this, and it's going to feel a hell of a lot better.
Mhm.
There's some of those animal studies, if you look into ones by like JC Lotz, they show that dynamic loading of rat spines results in an anabolic environment. So it's not just this, there's like static and dynamic loading. The studies by McGill were static loading. It's not in a living tissue. You just kind of do it at this one point in time, and you do it until there's an eventual failure. You take a living tissue and you take periods of loading followed by periods where it's not loaded and it goes about its day-to-day life. And if you check out the contents of the spine, there's actually indications that it's now an anabolic environment and it's adapting positively to that stress. And like, we might think that's crazy, but it's not crazy. Like every part of our body does that. When we look at changes in bone density, the bones in our body most adaptable to loading are our vertebrae and pelvis. Those are the bones that will change the most through lifting. So I think like if we want to be pessimistic about this and just grab the studies or the examples or the anecdotes or the personal experiences where lifting or doing something like that is bad, we can do that and we can live in that space. But we can just as easily be optimistic or just sort of fit everything into this worldview where it makes sense that applying stress to the body is complex. Sometimes it doesn't work out great, but the vast majority of the time, if you're smart about it, you have a system and you're incremental about how you do it, you make things more resilient, you make them harder to hurt. That's true for our bicep. That's true for the structures of the elbow. It's true for our spine. And you go about it that way. You give the body times of stress and then times where it can sort of recover and you give it the nutrients to do so and you focus on sleep. Uh, it's not such a hot take to think that like loading our spine through different ranges tends to be a good thing for it. And for a sport like jiu-jitsu, which will definitely load your spine through those ranges. I went to class the other night and we were doing situations from side smash. I'm literally lying there, my shoulders are flat on the ground, my hips are pulled 90 degrees to the side. Like we are loading it in actually an endpoint range of motion. And from there, we're then going live and exerting maximal effort. So I think in a sport context where it's inevitable, you better figure out a way to do it in a deliberate fashion in the weight room to get us ready for that stress. But then I would also argue is even if you don't train jujitsu, it's worse for you to be sedentary. Those injuries occur at a greater rate in the sedentary population. So let's not do that.
Mhm.
And you can actually see benefits from all sorts of training, from different like strength sports, from different forms of cardio. There's another famous study where they look at rowers and they show that different proteins in the intervertebral disc indicate that there is an anabolic environment from rowers, from the loaded flexion that occurs as they're rowing. So it doesn't even, we don't have to be dogmatic about this. You don't have to just do like Zercher deadlifts with me. You could run, and that could be really good for your back. You can do some rowing. You can do like different rotational power movements. The list goes on and on. There's lots of ways to improve spine health. But in general, the one thing that tends to not be good for it is complete and total avoidance. So definitely don't do that.
Yeah. I think that people oftentimes think that it's either that or it's like a recklessness toward loaded flexion or toward loaded rotation like that. Those are the only two options. And I think, living in those two spaces, neither of those is helpful. And I think you do such a great job navigating the middle. We'll definitely link your YouTube video because I know you put a lot of hard work into it. And one of the things I appreciate a lot about you is I think the first time I ever went into your office, I was like, oh, look at these numbers written on this sticky note. I know what those are. Those are PubMed ID numbers. Like, I
Yep.
appreciate very much that you take that to heart. You take that very seriously. Looking at the research and what that says, and very pragmatic in that way. So I hope that gives people a little bit of peace of mind. I get it. I hurt my back too in 2011 or so. And I was like, I can't sit, I can't lay down, I can't stand up. Like it was bad. It was in a lot of pain, but I'm here and I'm lifting, and you get through that. And to your point, like having that positive outlook is so important. Is so important. And in jujitsu, especially, I mean, we're just like, there's nothing in jujitsu that's like gentle. Somebody's going to be stacking you or blanketing your whole body out. And you're like upper body's twisted one way and your lower body's twisted the other way. And specifically for this sport, even I play a lot of spider guard. So the person who's standing has that great pleasure
For
of
sure.
being bent over. And then the amount of people who are like, I can't do this drill for a minute because my back is hurting. And I'm like, it needs to be stronger.
Yeah, I had a
You know?
client that, they were actively training jujitsu and they were telling me they couldn't do deadlifts because of their back. And then I saw a video that they posted where they were doing a triangle escape, like the typical triangle escape where you sort of like shrug your shoulders forward and you're like lifting your hips and like pushing yourself backwards and out, but essentially like lifting another human being, and because their hips are attached to your upper body off the ground to put pressure on where the triangle is locked up, flexing the spine and walking backwards. I showed them this. I'm like, okay, that person weighed more or less than 135 pounds. They're like, more, they weighed like 200. I'm like, okay. And your back was totally rounded. And like they already knew where I was going with that, but like, why can't you deadlift 135 pounds in a controlled setting? You can. And
Mhm.
again, like you were saying, it's about that middle area. It's not like, okay, let's max out your deadlift, right? And go total ooga booga until like one of your eyes is red and bloodshot. But like, also let's not avoid it entirely. Like, I like to use an example of a weight on a bar that's less than that person's body weight for a deadlift. Most people in their day-to-day life move their body weight or around that through like a deadlift type motion. Like that's not a strange thing. If you have to slide your couch over, if you like, the list goes on and on. Like we do that in our daily life, especially if you train a combat sport, you're moving another human that weighs like what you weigh, like always, like often. So sort of breaking that down of like, people aren't out there fear mongering, like, okay, guys, when you get triangled, just get triangled because triangle are going to destroy your spine. Like there's no one out there doing that, but there are people out there doing that as it relates to deadlifts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they associate that fear, even though biomechanically, like if we looked at like, their L4S, L4, L5 vertebrae, and mapped out what was occurring there in terms of total forces, shear forces, compressive forces during a 135-pound deadlift versus a triangle escape, like the forces are probably greater during the triangle escape. So yeah, I think it's like breaking down that fear, encouraging people, being like, no, look, this is okay. This is fine. There's times where I show them where I'm like, yeah, actually, I just deadlifted 100 pounds less than I did the week before because I'm living in that gray area. And there's some signs for me that were like, hey, maybe don't push it as hard as last week. But
Mhm.
doing it 100 pounds lighter is so much better than just being like, oh, my back feels kind of funny because I had that podcast with Steph, so I didn't deadlift at all, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, on that note, I'm going to let you go deadlift. I very much appreciate this conversation so much. Thanks for sharing your expertise with the listeners. If there's anyone out there who is like, okay, I need to explore like training options specifically for jujitsu and strength training, tell us about what you offer and how people can find out more.
Yeah, so we have a training app called Electrum Performance. It's the same name as my gym, my Instagram, YouTube channel. Electrum is spelled Electrum. And through our app, we have, more inexpensive options for people who just want a little bit of guidance, all the way up to like remote coaching, where you would get like video calls with a coach, either me or we mentioned, that I have other coaches at my facility. So yeah, there's lots of options like that. We also share a ton of content for free. I welcome people to like check us out, message us. We love talking about this stuff.
Awesome. All right. We'll link all of that up in the show notes and when it goes out. Thanks so much for being with me. And I'll see you on Friday.
All right. It was my pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.